Can you think of a time when it would be extremely important for you to stay awake? I can think of a good time. Now would be really nice. And for the next 40 minutes or so, that'd be a good time, I think. Or how about when you're traveling down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour? Good time to stay awake? Generally speaking, it's a good time. Although there's more to it than that, as one lady found out. She was driving down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour, and she had a cell phone glued to her ear. And it wasn't until the car went by on the shoulder on the other side with his horn blaring did she realize that she was well over the center line. So she was awake, but it almost caused her an accident because she wasn't really paying attention to what she was doing. And that's rather interesting, isn't it? Because the Bible makes a very interesting statement about being awake like that too. There's more to it than just not sleeping. Would you like to take your copy of the Bible and turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5? And let's look at verse 6 for a moment. Because here the encouragement is, in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 6, "So then, let us not sleep on as the rest do, but let us stay awake and keep our senses." Yeah. Interesting comment. So the lady with the cell phone, she was awake, but she wasn't keeping her senses about her driving. The Bible is saying here that spiritually it's the same, that we have to be awake and aware of or keeping our senses of what's happening around us. Do you realize how difficult it is to stay awake and keep your senses? Physically, I mean. Do you know how difficult that is? Well, one radio announcer found out how difficult it was. He decided he was going to take 200 hours, 8 days, and he was going to stay awake for the whole time, and he was going to raise money for a charity. And they recorded his experience in a book called Sleep. Kind of interesting. After just a little more than 2 days, he was going to put his shoes on in his hotel room, and to his eyes, there were cobwebs in his shoes. And at the table in the room where he was sure that those marks on his table, those were insects. He was sure of it. Just after a little more than 2 days. And when he got to his radio announcing booth, you know how it is out of the corner of your eye sometimes? He was sure there was a rabbit in there. And remember, that's only after a little more than 2 days. After 4 days, it was quite interesting what was happening to him by then. In his radio booth, he found that there's a number of tests you have to do regularly in order to keep things operating properly. He could only do 1 or 2 of a whole battery of tests that were required. Anything that required any sort of concentration or mental agility was just absolutely out of the question. He had lost any ability to do that. And what was worse was by 4.5 days, just 110 hours into his little project, he was starting to have signs of delirium. In other words, at times he'd see grotesque figures and funny things would really happen to him. Now, after just 5 days, what happened? Well, now he's about to open a bureau drawer, and he pulls it open, and he runs screaming out of the building because the whole thing was on fire. Of course it wasn't. It only appeared that way to him. And after just 6 days, he was completely disoriented. He didn't know who he was, where he was, or why he was there. So stay awake and keep your senses. It's impossible physically. It is, isn't it? You see, you have to have sleep in order to stay awake for short periods of time and keep your senses. But to stay awake physically and keep your senses, it's impossible. And you know, brothers, with that statement there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 6, where it told Christians to stay awake and keep their senses, impossible. It's impossible. Just like it's impossible physically. Except, of course, with physical staying awake, you need to sleep a little bit to rejuvenate yourself. For Christians, we need Jehovah every day as a part of our life. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And, there's a good example of that if you just go back to the first verse in that chapter, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 1. And just notice an example where we can test this out. Because there Paul wrote, "Now as for the times and the seasons, brothers, you need nothing to be written to you." Well, what time or season was he talking about? Well, there he was referring to the end of the Jewish system, but today he's talking about the end of the system where we're living in. So he says you don't need to be told that it's the time of the end. And that's true, isn't it? We all believe that. It's the time of the end. Are we the only ones that believe we're living in the time of the end? No, we're not. In fact, you may talk to people at the door and ask them that. So, do you think this crime or these problems we're seeing could be an indication we're living in the last days? And people say, yeah. So we're awake to that. They're awake to that. But just go down to verse 8 and 9 and notice the difference between those who might be awake to something, the difference between those who actually gain salvation. Let's read that together. It says, but as for us who belong to the day, notice, let us keep our senses and have on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet the hope of salvation. Because God assigned us not to wrath, but to the acquiring of salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. So again, he equates salvation with having our senses about us spiritually. But you notice what qualified that? It said if we had our senses spiritually, if we were keeping our senses, we would have on this breastplate of faith. And that's very interesting because faith is a quality that moves us to action. In fact, that's how we can tell if we have faith, really, is because what we know or what we understand, what we believe, will move us in a certain direction. It's not a case of, well, I believe. It's not an idea, but it's something that moves us forward. Faith is an active quality. So in other words, he was saying that those who would gain salvation are ones that would have their senses so that what they know about the truth would be moving them to action. And that's really it. And so that's the way it is for us, brothers, that if we are keeping our senses, it's more than just knowing something about the truth. Now, if you just turn back to Matthew chapter 24 and verse 34, you'll see another example that Jesus gives us as to how we might just test this out. Matthew chapter 24, of course, he's talking about the time of the end. And in verse 34, he makes an interesting statement here. He says, truly I say to you, that this generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur. Okay, confession time. How many of you have ever said to somebody, you see, the end can't be very long, because those who saw the start of 1914, the trouble in 1914, that generation will not pass away until all these things occur. I did. Of course we did, because that's the way we saw it, didn't we? Until, of course, November 1995. And then we had opportunity to realize that each case where Jesus used the word generation, he always meant the same thing when he said that. And so he was talking about the wicked generation who may have seen the sign but paid no attention to it. So it wasn't the anointed of Jehovah who saw the things happening back in 1914 who would not pass off the scene. So there was some adjustment there. Now, you see, if we're awake to that fact, we may have read the Watchtower, but you see, have we kept our senses about that? Because it seems in some cases what has happened is they've seen that written in the Watchtower and they've said, well, look, there you go. Who knows when the end's going to be now? Could be a long time in coming. Could be way down the line. And what begins to happen if we develop that thinking? Well, we start to replace the urgency of the time with other things. And we begin to get distracted. And that's happened with some brothers. It has. And so we have to be careful. You see, there's one thing about being awake, knowing that we're living in the last days. But there's another thing about keeping our senses. And our senses mean that we have to have a sense of urgency about the time we're living in. And it's of interest to note, remember that at our circuit assembly, there was a nice illustration that helped us to see how Jehovah's day is like waiting for a baby. Do you remember that? You see, the wife's going to have a baby, so what you do is you get the nursery all ready, you paint the walls and put up some wallpaper, and maybe you put in some new carpet, and you get somebody to build you a beautiful new crib or a cradle, and you get everything just perfect. And then the due date comes, and no baby. And a week goes by, still no baby. 2 weeks go by, and so you say, that's it. You might as well tear this room apart. Obviously, this baby is not coming. But you know what? That baby's coming. There isn't anything that you can do to stop it. It is coming. And that's like Jehovah's day. You see, Jehovah's day, brothers, that baby's coming. And there isn't a thing that you can do to stop it. And it hasn't changed one bit. Jehovah's timetable has not altered one iota. In fact, if you just go down 2 verses from that verse 34, you'll notice in verse 36, sometimes we forget that this verse was there all the time when it said, concerning that day and hour, nobody knows, neither the angels of the heavens nor the Son, but only the Father. And so we're not thinking correctly when we try to say, well, the generation is 70, 80 years, therefore, you get to that line, that's it, Jehovah's got to do something. His timetable was already set. We don't know. And so, brothers, don't allow that to offset your sense of urgency and think the end's a long way off. It's not. In fact, the stress and pressure that you're experiencing in your life is an evidence that we are right on the brink. Yeah. So we need to maintain our sense of urgency. Otherwise, what happens is we begin to adopt the characteristics and lifestyle of this system of things, and we need to try to avoid that. And when we keep our senses about the urgency of the time, it's kind of interesting, it has an accumulative effect, and it has a real impact on the entire congregation. It's collective, When we think that way as a people in general, you can see it and sense it amongst the brothers. And, I personally enjoyed walking into your congregation on Tuesday night because when I did, I noticed something a little different about you. That it just seems like there's a real renewing of that sense of urgency in a greater way. There was a warmer atmosphere in the Kingdom Hall, and it just seems like you brothers and sisters are really pulling in the right direction. And after the meeting, there's lots of chatter and conversation and loud talk and happy smiling faces. And, it's an indication, brothers, that you're taking that seriously. And that's what we have to do. We have to find our place in the congregation. We have to find our joy and happiness here. And not allow anything that's happening around us to lose our sense of urgency. So you want to keep working at that, brothers, and not lose that. So we're going to talk about a few things that we can kind of keep in mind over the next number of months that will help us just to keep focused and really not only just to be awake, but to keep our senses about some interesting things. So take your Bible, please, and turn to Judges chapter 17. And you may recall that a few weeks back we had discussed this man Jonathan in our Bible reading. Actually, it was the number 4 topic, Judges chapter 17. And let's just see if we can discover something about this young man that might help us in keeping our senses. So in Judges chapter 17, just look down to verse 7. It says, "Now there happened to be a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, and he was a Levite, and he was residing there for a time." So you notice, first of all, we're talking about a young man here, and he had a special assignment from Jehovah. It says here he was a Levite. And it's kind of like us, I guess. We have a special assignment from Jehovah, don't we? He's asked us to preach the good news of the kingdom. So that's special. Once it's over with, it'll never be repeated. And, of course, it's like the Levitical priesthood. You see, once it ended, it was over. So he had a special assignment. And you notice in verse 8 it says about him, it says, "And the man proceeded to go from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to reside for a time wherever he might find a place. At length, while going his way, he came into the mountainous region of Ephraim, as far as the house of Micah. Then Micah said to him, 'Where do you come from?' At that he said to him, 'I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm on my way to reside for a time wherever I may find a place.'" Interesting. As a Levite, what was his responsibility? You see, he should have been considering his work at the tabernacle in Shiloh at this time. The temple wasn't built yet, but he had responsibilities towards the tabernacle in Shiloh. And did you notice what he was doing? He was kind of wandering around trying to find something to do. He was saying, "Well, I'll reside wherever I might find a place." And so he was out scouring the countryside. Maybe he liked camping, I don't know. Like maybe he was an outdoors man, and off he was looking for something to do to occupy his time and keep himself busy. And, he was just looking for something to do. And he was going to go find some place to hang out for a while. That's what he was up to. In verse 10 it tells us, "So Micah said to him, 'Do dwell with me and serve as a father and priest for me, and I, for my part, shall give you 10 silver pieces a year, and the usual outfit of garments, and your sustenance.' Accordingly, the Levite went in. Thus the Levite took it upon himself to dwell with the man, and the young man got to be as one of his sons to him." Was it proper for Jonathan to serve as a priest for Micah? Was that proper? No. No, you see, the priesthood was really supposed to serve Jehovah at the tabernacle. And he wasn't even a priest anyways, he was a Levite. So he really wasn't following through on Jehovah's arrangement of things. And did you notice why he did it? 10 silver pieces. Some nice threads. Food and lodging. That's why he was doing it. It was an offer he felt he couldn't refuse. So what he did was he compromised, and he took up a form of worship that really wasn't in harmony with Jehovah's arrangement of things. So you might say that he betrayed Jehovah for money. Didn't he? Yeah, he really did. He betrayed Jehovah for the things he could have, for money and for the lifestyle that he was looking for. And he gave up Jehovah's worship for that. And so, what a sad thing, eh? That he would actually betray Jehovah for money. Would you ever betray Jehovah for money? Would you do that? And I'm sure you're saying no. And that's the right answer. Because we wouldn't want to do that, would we? We wouldn't want to betray Jehovah for money. But it's an easy thing to do, brothers. It is. Paul said about our day that today people would be lovers of pleasures rather than lovers of God. And it's easy where we live here in this country to get into that, to think about money in the sense of what it can do for us and what it can buy us and where we can go with it, and to become preoccupied. The Bible teaches about a simple lifestyle. And it's hard to do that here, isn't it? I mean, every year there's all sorts of new things, interesting things that come out, gadgets we can buy and places we can go. And more and more we see that people aren't satisfied. They're not satisfied with an older car. They need to drive a new car. And they're not satisfied with the old decorations. They have to have new decorations. And, the yard was nice, but now we want to make it nicer. And, it grows and gets bigger and it complicates our lives. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, necessarily. But it can distract us. And then it becomes, at times, we may do these things because they bring us pleasure. And it may rob us of time that we need spiritually. So what's happened is that, we're awake to the fact that materialism can get a hold of people, but are we really keeping our senses about it? And so we have to think about that. One brother said, I just wish that Satan would tempt me with materialism just once. Because he was always having money problems. And, it's true, many of us here in the congregation, we struggle from paycheck to paycheck to try to make ends meet. And, I don't have to tell you what that's like. I'm sure most of you feel that. And so it's a struggle to keep going in this system. And when it's like that, it's hard to imagine. I mean, how can you be materialistic? Please, Satan, just tempt me once. I'd like to have a little extra money and some things to have. So, that being the case, we still have to be reminded that a simple life is the kind of life that Jehovah recommends. And then, of course, for the rest of us who maybe have a fairly comfortable lifestyle, that's where we really have to start to watch. That it's not making inroads in our spirituality. And what's of interest too when we think about it, I remember a comment that Brother Pandachuk made one time. When he came back from Africa, he said that over there, or he said people here say about the brothers in Africa, they seem to do so much with so little. And he said when they look at what we have over here, he said they say, well, boy, they do so little with so much. And of course, that's not true of all of us, is it, brothers? It's not. But you see, in comparison, it can be such a distraction for us. So we have to keep our life simple. And one thing we have to watch out for is that simply saying, well, I know that, you see, doesn't necessarily mean we're keeping our senses, because notice in verse 13 of this same chapter here, what happened to Micah and Jonathan. It said in verse 13, hence Micah said, now I do know that Jehovah will do me good, because the Levite has become priest for me. Do you notice what he was saying? He was saying, well, Jehovah's certainly going to bless me now because I've got this priest here. And we're going to sacrifice to him and everything's going to be just wonderful. Boy, was he wrong. He thought he was in the truth. He thought he was doing right. So, you see, it can happen even that way with material things. So, brothers, a simple life is the best. And when we do that, it helps us to make sure that we're keeping our senses. And that's why in 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 5 reminds us of a very good point that will help us to be able to keep this thing on track. Because there it tells us in 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, it says, keep testing whether you are in the faith. Keep proving what you yourselves are. And so periodically we have to take a look at it and see how we're doing and see what adjustments we can make. And that proves, brothers, that we're staying awake and keeping our senses. Okay, let's think about this a little farther now. How many of you here believe that Jehovah's Witnesses have the truth? How many of you believe that? Okay, good. Now, we're awake to that fact, right? I mean, now we don't have to be convinced of that anymore. But you know what? Because we believe it's the truth, that's no longer the issue. You really know what the question is now? The question is, now what? Now what? You know it's the truth. Now what? What are you going to do with it? Young people, you know it's the truth. What are you going to do with it? Now what? Where are you going with it? What are your plans? What are your goals? You see, it's not just enough to say, yeah, I believe it's the truth. Now what? What plans have you got? You see, Paul put it this way. Just turn to Philippians chapter 3 and verse 13. And just notice the whole tenor, the whole attitude that he's trying to describe here about those who believe that this is the truth. In Philippians chapter 3, starting in verse 13, he says, "Brothers, I do not yet consider myself as having laid hold on it." Now he's talking about the prize of everlasting life. He says, "But there's one thing about it. Forgetting the things behind and stretching forward to the things ahead, I am pursuing down toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God." You notice that? See, he says there that, you forget yesterday, forget the past. He said, stretch forward. And he puts it, he says, stretching forward to the things ahead. What do you call that? When you're stretching forward, what do you call that? You're reaching out, aren't you? That's what we call it. That's the spirit he was talking about. Is that we know it's the truth, so now what? Well, he says, reach out. You see, set goals, have a determined, fixed course in the direction in which you're going in your life. And in verse 15, he tells us, "Let us then, as many of us as are mature, be of this mental attitude. And if you're mentally inclined otherwise in any respect, God will reveal the above attitude to you." Now, don't misunderstand. Jehovah's not going to force us to have that attitude. What he's saying there is that we need to ask him, if we're not inclined to reach out, he says, well, ask me and I'll help you to develop it. Do you understand why it's so important to progress in the truth? Do you know what it's like? You see, if you had a parent with a young child, and when they're 2 years old and they teach them the ABCs, it's wonderful, isn't it? When they get to be 4 years old, it's okay, they're able to say their ABCs. But when they get to be 10 or 12, it's no big deal when Mom says, "Okay, John, tell them your ABCs." And when they get to be 18, "Come on, John, tell them your ABCs." And 25, it's definitely not a joke anymore. In fact, it's quite embarrassing, isn't it? You see, brothers, we don't want to stay at the ABCs. We want to make sure that we progress beyond that. And it's not just a matter that it's the truth and we've accepted that. That's elementary. It's the ABCs of what we've learned. Now we have to go beyond that. And as young people, to be young, to have the whole world in front of you. In Jehovah's organization, you have the whole world at your disposal. You can do all kinds of things in the truth. So much is open to you. We had a young couple in Regina. They began to pioneer and moved down to Toronto, and they went into a Spanish congregation. He learned Spanish very quickly. They both did. And they decided to do something with that, so they ended up going down to the country of Bolivia. And when they got there, the branch asked them to special pioneer. Just a young couple. And they had some absolutely marvelous experiences. They went down from La Paz, which is where they were stationed, and they went down into the jungle area, and they were told that where they were going, no one had ever witnessed there before. And they had a wonderful time. When they got to one village, they got there, and to their shock and surprise, this fellow who was sitting in the square recognized who they were and came up and said, "Brothers!" And they were just shocked, like, where did this guy come from? And they found out that a man had been up in La Paz and had got a Bible and a Live Forever book, and went back into the jungle. And it turned out that he was somewhat of a drinker, and so he needed some money, so he sold his Bible and Live Forever book to this young man. And so he read it, and he realized this is the truth. And so he went back and he started to read through it again, and he realized he needs to preach. And so that's what he was doing. And when they got there, he was already preaching to people in the village. So one of the brothers that went with them was a branch committee member. So they studied with him every day, twice a day, for the 2 weeks they were there. And then when they left, they realized there's no reason this guy couldn't qualify as an unbaptized publisher. So they did. They assigned him as an unbaptized publisher. And it was just an absolutely delightful experience. Another time they were going up into what they call the Altiplano, and going up higher up into the mountains. And as they were going along, they came across this teenage boy, and so they began to witness to him. And he says, "My dad's one of you." "Really? Where's your dad?" "Way down there, about a mile back down the mountain." He says, "Well, okay, take us to your dad." And so back down they went, and when they got to the young fellow's home and they opened the door, you'd never believe it. There was the dad up in the front, and there was a group of about 9 or 10 others sitting there, and they were conducting a meeting. And as soon as the brothers walked in, the dad recognized them right away as the brothers, and he says, "The brothers have arrived," and they turned the meeting over to them, and they had to finish it. Oh, it was such a delight for them, But it's just an example, of the things that we can do. And maybe it's not your desire to go off to a foreign assignment, and that's fine. You don't have to do that. But to serve Jehovah, there's so many wonderful things to do in his organization. One young sister recently went with her parents over to Lithuania, and they started to build a kingdom hall just inside of the Russian border in the province of Kaliningrad in Sovetsk. And before she left, I guess she was a somewhat typical Jehovah's Witness teenage youth, happy to be in the truth, but we've always had the truth. There's nothing special. We've always been like this. And she went over there, and when people found out that she had been raised with the truth, they went, "You've always known Jehovah? Always? Your whole life? You've never known anything else? What's it like to always have known Jehovah?" And they were just awed. And you wouldn't believe what it did for her. She came back a different person. They had such appreciation. Over there, if you've been in the truth 5 years, you've been in the truth a long time. And here she'd been in it her whole life. And they were very, very appreciative of that. And so we want to appreciate that too. You young ones who've been raised in the truth, you want to appreciate what you've got. Set some goals. And don't let your goal be a comfortable life. Okay? Don't just be comfortable. We don't want to just be comfortable. We want to serve Jehovah in a meaningful way. We want to do things for him. And Jehovah promises he'll always take care of you. Remember on Tuesday night we talked about exert yourself vigorously. That's what Jehovah says. That's where the blessing is. That's where real happiness comes from. So one of the goals we can set. You may recall in the March 15th Watchtower of 1998, there was one very excellent paragraph. And this isn't just for young people. This is for all of us. As a congregation, we want to set this as a goal. If in fact we're not doing it, or if we can elevate this goal, because there's a lot to it. Okay, I'm just going to read what this paragraph says. It says, "A witness demonstrates that he has made the truth his own by commenting at Christian meetings." There's a good goal. At first, he may recite what is stated in the publications being studied. In time, however, he will progress to the point of expressing Bible teachings in his own words. He thus gives evidence that he is developing his thinking ability, not merely repeating what others have said. Framing thoughts in his own words and expressing correct words of truth in a heartfelt way will bring him delight and show that he's convinced in his own mind. So remember that? See, there's a goal that some of us really can reach out for, is to comment at every meeting. And in order to do that, you notice it said that that's really based on what we do before the meeting, personal study. And you know, brothers, when you do your personal study, don't just try to underline answers in the paragraph. Do you know how we should really study? We should read the paragraph, and then we should think in our mind about what the main point was. You know, force the mind to think, okay, what did I just read? And then underline that. And when you come to a section head, you know, you're finished the subheading, then go back and ask yourself, now what were the main points in that section? And force your mind to think about it. Because you know what happens? As you do that, it literally develops thinking ability. Because as you're thinking about it, it starts to draw thoughts from other areas, things that we can connect together with it. And the truth grows and expands. That's where we start to get application from. We start to realize that, hey, this principle applies over here. And we grow. And that's the building block of any goals that we have in the truth. And that's what keeps us going active in the field service. That's what keeps us active as Christians. And you know what? It also keeps us happy in spite of our problems that we have to face in this system of things. So try to do that, brothers. And if you're making notes, you want to write down as well the article in the May 15th, 98 Watchtower, page 24. And it was an article entitled, You Can Make Spiritual Progress. You know what else would be a good goal? Maybe we could all set this goal too. Starting another Bible study. And you know, it's not as hard as sometimes we think it might be. Oh, it's true, and we were talking with some of the brothers this week that starting a Bible study is a little more challenging than it used to be 20 years ago. But it's not beyond our ability to do that. And this week we've been talking about the use of jawbone. And tomorrow morning we're going to talk about it again as to how it is that we can use this effectively in starting Bible studies. And so, brothers, we really want you to think about that. Do all you can on each call to try to use this brochure effectively to start a Bible study. And if you set that as a goal, I know that you'll reach that, if it's really your heart's desire. And you have to think about the field ministry a lot. I guess it's a lot like being a heart surgeon. You know, somebody needs to have bypass surgery, so the surgeon opens up the chest cavity and goes in, and he may do the bypass surgery, and his operation is very well done, very skilled, but then he doesn't close up the chest cavity. You know what happens, eh? The operation's a success, but the patient dies. And our ministry is a lot like that. You know, we can go out and we can offer to people literature. We can open up the heart, open up the chest cavity. But if we don't make return visits and start Bible studies, then it's the same thing. You see, the operation was a success. We got literature into their hands, but the patient dies. So we need to start Bible studies, brothers. And that's a goal we need to set as a congregation and continue to work at that. So let's just think about one more area. Turn with me to Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1. Now here it says that, brothers, even though a man takes some false step before he is aware of it, you who have spiritual qualifications, try to readjust such a man in a spirit of mildness. So you'll notice the direction here, that Jehovah says that one of the ways that we can be helped in the congregation is by spiritually qualified older men who can help to readjust us. And sometimes that can be done even before we're aware of it. But what's of interest is that these spiritually qualified men are spiritually qualified because of what the Scriptures say. So, for example, in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, one of the things it says there about these men is that they would be qualified to teach. And that means they would understand the Scriptures sufficiently to be able to assist us where we may need that. And, of course, in chapter 3 and verse 3, it also says that they would be reasonable. And so a reasonable person is someone who's yielding, who's able to see principle but at the same time recognize the need that others have to apply it themselves. And so that's when a man's able to balance those qualities out to a reasonable degree, then we appoint him as an elder in the congregation, and he helps our brothers and sisters. And that's the goal we have to reach towards too, is to try to develop that kind of spirituality and balance in our life, in our thinking. But it's kind of interesting what happens. We get to know one another pretty well in the congregation, and we find out that ones are making decisions in their lives, and we get to know about the decisions. And sometimes what happens is that when our brother or sister makes a decision, it's not the decision we'd make. And sometimes we're okay with that. And other times we're not particularly happy with it. And so we might even at times be a little upset because our brother made this, what we view to be a silly decision. Just as an example, maybe a family would choose to allow their children to get involved with a club at school. And so we think about that and we go, well, now listen, you got to be concerned about bad association and, that involvement with the world. It's also time involved. And you conclude and say, well, you know what? I would never allow my children to get involved in a club at school. It's just not safe spiritually. And you know what, brothers? If you conclude that, fantastic. But maybe somebody else concluded it differently. And now we start looking at that and we go to our other brother or sister and say, did you hear about that? Did you know that they were letting their children go to this club? That's so stupid. Or maybe it's something as simple as a two-door car and you say, what in the world would someone buy a two-door car for? The dumbest thing I ever heard. And so we have these strong opinions sometimes, brothers, don't we? And but you see what happens is when we talk about them to others, when somebody makes a decision that's different than ours, then what we do is kind of erode the brother's confidence in others. And that's why it takes spiritual balance, doesn't it? To be able to realize, well, okay, that's not the decision I would make. But you know what? Jehovah gave them the responsibility of making that decision. And as long as it doesn't break Bible principles, they have the right to make that decision, and we don't want to undermine that. And so it would really make us feel bad, wouldn't it? If, in fact, after having said something about it, we found out that, the reason they joined the club was because it was a language club, and they were hoping to use that to further their pioneering. And you're going, what a dumb thing I did. Why did I go about talking about that? But even if it wasn't a case like that, you see, it's good for us to remember the principle in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 11. In 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 11, it says, and to make it your aim to live quietly and to mind your own business. See, sometimes we just have to mind our own business. That's good counsel, isn't it? Simple and direct. But, it takes a measure of spirituality and insight to be able to realize where that line is. Where we're trying to be helpful to our brothers and sisters and where it is that we're imposing our conscience on others. So, brothers, remember, it's good counsel. If our brothers make a decision, we have to remember, mind your own business. And that doesn't mean that we're not concerned about one another or we want to grow apart. No, that's not the point. But we do want to give the dignity and the responsibility to our brothers without undermining the decisions that they make. And that can happen in so many areas. It can be where we live, the job we choose, what we wear, the way we discipline our children, our view of time, personality things, and the list could go on and on. So really the point is to always try to do the loving thing. And you may recall, too, this particular article. It's the May 8th, 98 Awake. It was Love Never Fails, Do You? And, of course, in the final analysis, it said to clothe yourselves with tender affections of compassion, kindness, lowliness of mind, mildness, and long-suffering. Continue putting up with one another, and forgiving one another freely if anyone has a cause for complaint against another. Even as Jehovah freely forgave you, so do you also. But besides all these things, clothe yourselves with love, for it is a perfect bond of union. So if we do the loving thing, then we won't be encroaching upon our brothers. And I thought it was of interest in this article. It talked there about an anonymous quotation. You may remember it. It went something like this. Righteousness without love makes us hard. Do you know what kind of person that is? See, somebody who just wants what's right, or the letter of the law. They become rule-oriented. So if we just make rules, then it makes us hard, because love tempers that. So sometimes that's what happens if we make a decision and someone else doesn't make the same decision, then we've kind of made a rule if we get a little upset about it. But love tempers that. And it also said faith without love makes us fanatical. And when I think about that, it makes me think of a sister that was very zealous for the ministry when she first learned the truth. But problem being that her husband, who was an unbeliever, needed her as part of his business arrangement. She was to answer the phone and do other such things. But, every time that he was gone, she was out the door. And he kept asking her, there's certain days you've got to stay home and, we've got to have you at the phone. But no, out she went because, she had faith. But her faith made her fanatical. You know what the end result was? She had a nervous breakdown and her husband left her. Sad consequence. So you see, our faith has to have love along with it. Then we're not fanatical. We don't do fanatical things. Of course, it said too that duty without love makes us peevish. You might think of working around the Kingdom Hall. You ever gotten peeved at somebody? Probably all of us have from time to time. But working around the Kingdom Hall sometimes can be like that. It seems in a lot of halls the work seems to fall on a few. And if they're not doing the work because they love to help out, because it's Jehovah's house, then you start thinking, well, how come it's always a few of us that are doing this? And you start to grumble and complain about it. And we start to get peeved at others. And then it's no longer any fun, is it? So it's good advice. It says that duty without love makes us peevish. So you may have a duty, but if you love to do it doesn't matter. And it also mentioned that orderliness without love makes us petty. Have you ever known a neat freak? They can't stand to have something out of place. So orderliness without love makes us petty, doesn't it? So we just can't stand to have that out of place. So it's an interesting quotation, but it brings us back to the point that it's love, brothers. If we do things out of love, then we'll always do what's right for our brothers and sisters. And when we do that, it becomes evident that we're not only staying awake, but we're keeping our senses too. So those are some things that we can give thought to over the next 6 months and continue to develop as a Christian people and grow in the warmth and love that you've developed in the congregation here. A rounded out, happier spirit that continues to grow, that will draw people into your congregation. And even when it comes to our more precise view on this generation, brothers, that doesn't mean Armageddon's any farther away. It means we have to maintain our sense of urgency. So Jehovah knows the time. But our responsibility is stay awake and keep your senses. Impossible to do physically, and yes, it's impossible to do spiritually too. Unless, of course, brothers, we work at it. Every day, have Jehovah part of our life. Set goals for ourselves so that we can be forward-reaching Christians, and we will be able to accomplish that. So tomorrow morning, we're going to have a field service arrangement here at 9:15. So we'd like to invite our publishers out to that. Tomorrow we will talk again about our Require brochure and how to use that effectively. So we'll sure enjoy having you out for that. At this point, what we'd like to have you do is to join our meeting by way of song. And I think it's an appropriate concluding song because it's proof of our discipleship. Song number 200. And that's really what we've been talking about, is proving to Jehovah that we're awake and keeping our senses. So let's stand and sing that song together. And Brother Camerata, we'd appreciate